There was an incident in one of the recreation yards where officers mistook two inmates that were sparring for the real thing. One of the inmates blended into the crowd of inmates in the yard. The other inmate tried to explain himself that they were only sparring in jest. The ranking officer wouldn't give an ear to what the inmate was trying to say. The inmate wanted to make his point and physically pushed the officer to get his point made. And that was something that never happened in prison. People respect each other's personal space. Inmates, unless there's an altercation, obviously inmates don't touch inmates, and officers don't touch inmates, and inmates don't touch officers. That set a precedent.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
The Witness to History program, again, is being operated under the auspices of the National Law Enforcement Museum. We do our 11th Witness to History event. It's called Attica Beyond the Riot. Now, a little background before I turn things over to our moderator and our panel. On the walls of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial are the names of 633 corrections professionals, and some 500,000 correctional officers risk their lives daily, providing for the custody and security of more than 2 million inmates in jails and prisons across our nation. Too often, those corrections professionals are underappreciated. And tonight you'll get a sense of what it's like to be a corrections professional working in very difficult and dangerous circumstances. Tonight we explore how in 1971 the most infamous prison riot in American history occurred at the Attica Correctional Facility in Attica, New York. When it was over, 7 correctional officers were dead. And I'd like to read their names here tonight. William Quinn, Edward Cunningham, John DiArcangelo Jr., Richard Lewis, Carl Vallone, Ronald Werner, and Harrison Whalen. 7 correctional officers killed in the Attica Prison Riot. Also among the dead were 4 civilian hostages and 33 inmates. Many prison reforms followed, and there was a great and long-standing controversy surrounding the actions taken that led to so much bloodshed, and we're going to be talking about that here tonight. And tonight, to help us tell the story of Attica behind the riot, is a distinguished panel, including 2 of the correctional officers who served in Attica in 1971. You have Donald Almeter and Michael Smith, and a university professor who has written a book about Attica to be published this year, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson. Look forward to hearing from each of them. And I also want to acknowledge another very special guest in the audience, Mr. John Stockholm. John, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. John was a correctional officer, and he was taken hostage in 1971 during the Attica Prison Riot. So he's come to join us here tonight for this discussion. Our distinguished moderator for this evening's program is Frank Bond, a journalist who has produced a number of award-winning documentaries for the museum, where he has worked since 1999. Before that, he had a 23-year career in television news. Many of us locals will remember that Frank was a reporter and an anchor here in Washington at WUSA TV 9. So at this time, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelist and moderator for this evening's Witness to History, Attica Behind the Riot. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Let me add my welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. You know, Craig reminded me how much age I'm putting on because I actually covered the dedication of the Law Enforcement Memorial when it first opened. Prior to that, the ceremony that was still moving was held on the west front of the Capitol. And it's really something, I don't know if you ever happen to be in Washington when they have their annual Law Enforcement Day, to come and see the law enforcement officers who come from all over the country and remind us of that even line, the people that dedicate their lives to keeping us all safe and whole as we go about our lives. This evening's program is an important discussion that we're going to have because, like so many events that took place in the tumultuous 60s and 70s, the prison riot at Attica set into motion a number of responses from the public, from state and federal government, from the corrections community, and not all of the fallout has yet been unraveled and put into its proper place. Well, our three panelists this evening are eminently qualified to tell us about what happened then, and then give us some insight as to where we are now and what ground we have yet to cover. First, let me introduce on my left Michael Smith, who was 22 years old when the 1971 Attica Prison Riot changed his life. The young correctional officer sustained massive injuries and was in recovery for several years. Today, Smith serves as the spokesman for the Forgotten Victims of Attica, an advocacy group started by Dee Quinn Miller, the daughter of slain Attica Correctional Officer William Quinn. Together, Smith and Miller speak out about the devastating cost of the riot, and they serve as advocates for the correctional officers who were held hostage and their families. To my right, Donald Almeter was also a young correctional officer at Attica when he was taken hostage by inmates during the riot. Almeter returned to correctional work in New York and later retired from the profession. Today, he volunteers with the Correctional Peace Officers Foundation to educate the public on the importance of correctional work and advocate for the well-being of all corrections officers. Finally, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson is a professor of African American Studies and History at Temple University. She recently completed the first comprehensive history of the Attica Prison Riot, due to be published this year. She's contributed to numerous scholarly and popular publications on topics of Attica, prison reform, and the history of incarceration in the United States. That's your panel. They have so much to offer. Please welcome them. I'm going to have each of you contribute to setting the stage for this discussion. So Donald, I want to start with you. If you can tell us what Attica was like prior to the riots. What was the environment like for the corrections officers, for the inmate population? Were there warning signs that pressure was building up? If so, how were they dealt with?
Well, the pressures were always there, and we knew it. With the riots were happening out in California, and we had there was a riot in Auburn in 1970 where they took hostages, poured gas on them. The state police came in and quelled it. We could feel it building up in Attica, just the way the inmates were acting, the way they were behaving. They were going on protests, refusing to eat, and it just kept getting worse. The administration had been notified of it. The unions had wanted more help to be kept over during the day shift when they were allowing large numbers out, and the state's answer was, we're not going to spend a couple $100 on overtime and it'll work out.
Dr. Thompson, what did your research indicate about conditions at Attica from the inmate standpoint? What was the experience like? What was the relationship like between the inmate population and the correctional officers working there?
Well, I think it was very complicated. On the one hand, I think it was a very tense environment for everybody because there was severe overcrowding. There were far too many people in the institution for what it was supposed to hold to start with. It was difficult for the corrections officers because they felt unsafe. They felt like they needed more support. Oftentimes being in charge of so many people at the same time, people who themselves had very I would argue, quite legitimate concerns about their conditions of confinement. And so the entire environment was very, very tense. And as Don mentioned, the administration of the prison was just completely unwilling to take these concerns seriously. Either the prisoner concerns that they needed more than one shower a month, that they needed basic things like toilet paper on the one hand, and on the other hand, completely turning a deaf ear to the corrections officers who felt very much that they were put in jeopardy. As for the relationships between them, I think it was complicated. I think that some corrections officers had quite good relationships with the people over whom, the people whom they kept as prisoners. I think there were also tense relationships. I don't think we can generalize, but I think what we can say for sure is that the administration was well aware that this was a problem that needed fixing for many partners, and indeed put everyone in jeopardy rather than fix them.
So, Michael, you're on the front line. Take us back to the beginning. Take us back to the day before the riot began, and then take us up to the moment that the violence erupted, and take us through that scenario.
The day before the Wednesday, September 8th, the day before the riot actually began, there was an incident in one of the recreation yards where officers mistook two inmates that were sparring for the real thing. And as the ranking officer and the correction officers approached the two inmates that were involved, one of the inmates blended into the crowd of inmates in the yard, and the other inmate tried to explain himself that they were only sparring in jest. And the ranking officer didn't listen, wouldn't really give an ear to what the inmate was trying to say. The inmate wanted to make his point and physically pushed the officer to get his point made. And that was something that never happened in prison. People respect each other's personal space. Inmates, unless there's an altercation, obviously inmates don't touch inmates, and officers don't touch inmates, and inmates don't touch officers. That set a precedent. And everyone in the yard, all the inmates in the yard and the officers gathered around the area where that happened. So that set a precedent, but the second precedent that was also set during that event was that a correction officer doesn't back down from the situation either. And they didn't press the issue. Their intent was to segregate that inmate and remove him to a different area of the prison where the issue could be dealt with. That didn't happen. The officers backed off. And that set the stage for what followed. The state formulated a plan, or the administration formulated a plan, that evening that they would extricate the two inmates involved in the altercation in the yard from their cells. And when officers went to remove one of the inmates, other inmates locked in their cells reacted violently and threw all kinds of objects out of their cells. And correction officers were able to extract the violator, if you will, from his cell and remove him to a different area of the prison. But there was such a fracas that they formulated another plan. And that was that the following morning, when the inmates were locked in their cells, that when they were released for breakfast, the other inmate involved in the incident would not be released with the rest of his company and allowed to go to breakfast. They'd go down to get him when they didn't have to worry about the rest of the population reacting to it, take the guy out of his cell. As Heather indicated, the facility was severely overpopulated at that time. It was built to house about 1,600 inmates, and at that time, the summer of '71, there were 2,200 there. When inmates were released for breakfast the following morning, each correction officer controlled two companies, which is approximately 80 people total on two different galleries, one floor. And when the inmates were released off that company to go to breakfast, one of the inmates, as they passed by the lockbox that controls the door opening and closing of the cells, reached over and cracked open the door of one of the other inmate that was involved, and he went to breakfast with the rest of the population. The count, who's in their cell, who's out of their cell, that followed them going to breakfast that morning indicated that it was discovered that that inmate was released and went to breakfast with the population. They formulated another plan, and that plan was that as the companies came back from breakfast and went to their respective recreation yards to be dispersed to their jobs, which occurred every morning after breakfast or wherever some had recreation, some had jobs that they went to, but they all went to the recreation yard, which there are 4 recreation yards there. And as they progressed from breakfast back through the maze, if you will, of above ground hallway system, as they went through that above ground corridor system, you have to, a central meeting place called Times Square is the main intersection in that tunnel system. And when you're in prison, a gate closes behind you before the one in front of you opens. As they progressed through that process, it was a time of morning when there was a lot of traffic. Prison traffic was at its peak. People are going to jobs, people are going to breakfast, people are going to the hospitals, people are going to their work details. And so there's a lot of inmate traffic. There was an officer that controlled the Times Square gate system, which was 4 physically huge metal gates controlled by a skeleton type key. And he controlled the traffic through those gates. The inmates came back from breakfast, progressed through Times Square, turned toward, this company came from A block, turned toward A block, and the door that would have been customarily every day opened into the recreation yard was closed and locked, as well as the gate in front of them, the A block gate. And when the gate closed behind them, they suspected something was up. The A block door gate opened, and officers, a number of officers came from the A block area, and their intent was to grab the other inmate that was involved in the incident the day before and remove him, isolate him from the rest of the company. And as officers approached the company, inmates knew something was up and assaulted the officers. That seemed to be the ignition that lit the flame for the explosion that followed. All of these inmates were locked in the A gate tunnel, and all this energy, human energy, turned back toward Times Square. And when they physically hit the gate, there was a fault in the gates where 2 metal parts didn't connect and had been painted over for years. The whole gate gave way under the human force behind it. They attacked the officer in Times Square, Bill Quinn, and took control of his keys, took the telephone out of Times Square, which effectively eliminated communication in the prison. It was a very antiquated communication system. And from there, it just spread like wildfire. They opened the gates, and they were already out of their cells, the biggest share of the population. And the officers were so outnumbered that it was easily taken control of.
Mm-hmm. Don, I want you to amplify this. Most people have never been inside a corrections facility. Clearly, routine is the first layer of security. You want to move prisoners a certain way at a certain time every day.
We were actually moving large numbers of prisoners back then. You could be going to the evening or morning chow or late chow, or be taking as many as between 80 and 100 inmates down the corridors, which are a little over 100 yards. They were already through the square before you actually got there. There was actually no control. We tried to, just so you know, we're talking 1970, we're antiquated. We did what they called a salt and pepper. You know, white guy, black guy, white guy, black guy, tall guys in the front, short guys in the back. So the officer actually, you know, we're all about the same height, 5'10", and you could actually see what the front guys were doing. Even you could see what they were doing, you still had no control. They were through the square area before you left the housing block. You know, like I say, the yards are 1 by 1, 100 by 100, and the corridors are only a little over 100, and they all pass through the magical Times Square. like Mike said, when they got inmates were locked in there and they kept manpower just pushing on the gate was faulty. No one ever knew it, and the gate gave way. And once it gave way, those inmates, they were smarter than we thought they were. They actually knew that they had the keys to get any place in that jail they wanted. They did. They proved it. They were going into housing blocks. They came into B block where I was. I had the keys for the gate in my pocket, and they opened the door. You know, throughout the years, the locks were old, antiquated. One key would start in A block and take you all the way back by the metal shops down to E block. That's all changed now. We're a little more secure at the facility now, and I talked to a lot of guys that work there. They still do the 40, I believe, in the company, and probably the only jail in the whole state of New York that has allowed 40 inmates at one time in a corridor with one officer.
It sounds like when the routine is broken, the corrections officers, you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants in terms of not losing total control. Once that routine is broken.
Oh, once it was broke, they had no control.
Yeah.
They were out in the open. I mean, they had a little door where they could peek out where the one guy stood. Didn't take much to break that metal door down. They broke the main gate. Officer Quinn, who was actually working that day, and what a lot of people don't know, he was actually working his day off. He was performing a swap for a guy that he owed a day for, and he died when he went to work on his day off. Beat on the first day, died on the third day.
Dr. Thompson, talk to me about the inmate population that may not have been a part of the original melee. When you're an inmate in a prison and a riot erupts, what kind of choices do you have?
Well, I think that this is sort of what I was saying originally about how it kind of all goes back, even this event goes back to preventable, to questions of prevention. So again, had all of those people, I think all of those people felt that change needed to happen. The officers who were put in this position, what's interesting about the story that Mike tells, you know, where people are actually prevented from going to the rec yard, locked in that one hallway, from what I understood, the officers themselves, the people in charge of those prisoners, were not given particularly the choice of whether that was a good idea or not. Essentially, the administration says, you're not letting these guys out to the yard. Well, of course, that put them in a very unsafe position. You've got all these people locked between two gates. They're panicking. It's tense, you know. So again, preventable. So for the rest of the prisoners, I mean, it's just all kinds of complicated stories. Some of them were looking at this happening over, hearing it and looking at it, and we're actually asking Bill Quinn, who they mentioned was in charge of Times Square, you know, please let us in, because they thought they'd be protected in Times Square. Some of them were actually asking to be let in for some protection. Others were just confused. They didn't know what was happening. I mean, you have to understand, I think this was happening so quickly. It was complete chaos so quickly. People were afraid. They didn't know, was this, you know, what kind of a uprising was this? What was happening? And so I think initially people very much wanted to just kind of protect themselves and get safe. And some of them actually protected some of the corrections officers. Some of them were very violent to the corrections officers, kind of depended. But at the end of the day, what was very interesting was that at least some of the prisoners had, I think, the foresight really to think, if you think about this as probably what actually saved a lot of lives, which was to move everybody to one place out in the open, which was D Yard. And then the hostages who had been taken, including these two gentlemen and John Stockholm sitting here, were placed in one specific area out in the open. And so then I think everybody else has to kind of come out into the open to at least have some measure of safety. So very quickly, what was very chaotic turned into a much more organized kind of, kind of goes from a riot to more of a, I guess, a formal rebellion or something, whereas each of the prisoner blocks elect someone to speak for them. There's an actual negotiating team. They ask for observers to come in to help oversee these negotiations with the state of New York. And they initially ask for certain people, some of whom arrive, some of whom don't. The state also adds their own people to this observers committee. And that's when this 4-day process begins of trying to negotiate better conditions for the prisoners. But it's really historic because there's television cameras. This thing is being televised across the nation, across the world. And so all eyes were riveted on Attica. Everything was taking place, both on television, but also, I mean, on the radio. Everyone was sitting, every night watching this unfold. And so it went from something very chaotic, I think, to something much more contained and much more organized. And so that's often what we see when we see the footage. We see those, the speeches, and then you'll see the footage of all these gentlemen who are in one area in the yard.
And we're going to see that in just a little bit. But once again, what we've heard is that these two corrections officers in a heartbeat go from being in charge of inmates to hostages. I want to hear both of your stories. Don, let's start with you. You're there. Tell me when it turned and what happened.
Okay, I started off in B block, which is mainly a metal shop building. All the workers live there. When we had the trouble, we got the call that the company was locked in the corridor. And so the guy that I was working with, we called him a hall captain. He said, go to the square and find out what's going on. So I went down and I talked to Quinn and a couple other officers. And their answer to me was, the yard door is locked. We're going to get the key and we're actually going to allow him to go out into the yard. And we know Lewis is in the block by himself. Well, why don't you go back to the block with Lewis? So I went back. I explained to Lewis. He said, we have no phone communications. I can't get a hold of nobody. We had what we call the bitch box between the square and the blocks. That didn't work half the time. So he locked me out of the block. I was behind B block with the two keys in my pocket. After they broke through Times Square, they came running down to B block, and you could hear them. They were breaking the windows, and it was total chaos. And someone said, get the keys. And I kind of laughed because I got the keys. They ain't getting them from me. They were smart enough that they went back and got the keys from Times Square and actually came and opened the gates in B block and actually opened the next set of gates and went, you were in Metal 1, right, Mike?
Yeah,
and they actually had access. We had locked the riot gates, which they broke down anyways. Michael was taken in Metal 1. I ended up in the fire building with the Sergeant Cunningham, who ended up getting killed. And the whistle was blowing, and his answer to all of us was, there'll be enough help here in a little while. Don't worry, they'll be coming in to get us. Well, that didn't happen. The only ones that came in to get us were the inmates. And when they came in, they started beating the officers, stripping you, ripping your clothes off. And then someone said, get them to the yard. And they run us down through a gauntlet. And down through the hallway we went. Most guys were barefoot, running on the broken glass. I still had my shoes on. I don't know why, but every time you'd bend over to take them over, some guy would hit you. So they ran us down there, naked, of course. And we get out there and our lily white asses are hanging out, All of a sudden, one of the inmates go, this is going to last a while, and we're actually in control because we've already made our demands. We want the news. We want certain negotiators. So they decided to dress us. And what they did is they dressed us in inmate clothing. It was better than nothing.
Wow. Michael, in the meantime, you were undergoing your own ordeal. Tell us about it.
I was located, like Donnie said, in Metal 1, which is near the rear of the prison, near the powerhouse. And I was on a second level floor. Inmates constructed and painted state institution lockers in that area at that time. The main metal shop was right directly below me with all the machines. And on the south side of the room that I was in, you could look out of the second story and look down into a garage area on the main ground. And you could tell something was happening. I was in charge of about 6 civilians that morning, civilian instructors. Their offices was in my area. And I was 22 years old at the time. Never really had any formal training. It was pretty much on-the-job training in the truest sense of the phrase. I'd worked at another prison and transferred to Attica. Anyway, you could hear the prison whistle blowing, and there wasn't a guidebook like when no signal indication, like the whistle blows so many times, that means this is happening. The thing just blew incessantly. The other time that I'd ever heard the prison whistle blow is when they had an escape. So you could look out those second-story windows. The inmates in my area looked out those second-story windows, and you could see on the ground level below inmates running around in an unsupervised fashion, grabbing whatever they could, football helmets, protective, some type of weapon, wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, whatever they could to protect themselves. There are several gangs represented in the prison society inside the walls. And the inmates that were under my supervision were scared. They were as scared as I was. And they thought that it was some type of gang trying to take care of, or trying to take control of the facility, some type of gang riot. So inmates in my area, took up weapons to protect themselves and actually physically tried to fit themselves into the lockers, which would be the equivalent of a high school locker. A short time thereafter, you could hear the rioting inmates as they came through B block and back to the machine shop area, ramming a gate with one of the forklift machines from the shop down below. So you knew what was going on. And I had locked the civilian instructors in their offices in the rear of that room and taken up a post near the front of the room. The inmates had pretty much all hidden themselves that were under my supervision. Wasn't long thereafter, and you could see angry inmates gather outside the entry doors to that room, and eventually my keys were ripped from my belt, the door was open, and the rioting inmates broke in. When they first broke into the room, I was knocked to the floor and beaten. And as I lay there on the floor, I can recall I had the wind knocked out of me, and as I laid there with the inmates kicking me and beating me, two inmates that I knew went spread eagle over my body with their hands against the wall and their feet in front of my side and said, "Leave him alone, he's a good guy." With that, this huge wave of angry emotion passed me and went to the rear of that room, broke down the office doors, took the civilian instructors hostages, and just as quickly as this human wave of emotion came rushing in, they rushed back out and left me alone in the room with the two inmates that had protected me. Two inmates tried to formulate a plan to hide me, but thought that if I was discovered in that area, I may be worse off than if they tried to get me to safety. So they put an arm over either shoulder and tried to escort me from the rear of the prison, the metal shop area, up through the tunnel system, up through Times Square, and where they eventually wanted to get me was to the administration building, which is in the front of the prison. As I was escorted through that area, through all the prison corridor system and through the block, through B block, you could see everything being broken and people running around in a chaotic, unsupervised manner, smashing everything that they could smash and igniting everything on fire that would burn. I made it as far as Times Square. Obvious, the inmate population was in control of a good share of the facility. And at Times Square, the inmates had already put up an inmate perimeter to block access to A block in the front of the prison and the administration building. And when my two captors got me to that point, they were directed by inmates that all hostages were to be taken to D Yard, and that's where I was taken.
And Dr. Thompson, you mentioned media coverage earlier on. This was more than a local story. This was a national story. This was a scary story, not only for that region, but to any place that had a prison nearby. How would you characterize the national media coverage of that time period from the beginning of the riot up to the state police moving in, which we're going to talk about in a minute?
Well, it was not just a national news story. It was actually an international news story. One of the reasons for that was that one of the observers at the prison was Tom Wicker from the New York Times, who is a very well-known columnist. And one of the reasons why the prisoners had asked for Tom Wicker was that he had reported previously about various prison reform efforts around the country, so they thought he might be a sympathetic figure. But the minute, of course, that he was there, but not just him, there was also State Senator John Dunn, there was also the quite famous lawyer William Kunstler. There was quite a few luminaries there. So immediately that brought a lot of national and international attention. And it's important to realize that while it was very scary, absolutely, and really a horrific experience for the people that lived it and endured it, at the time in the country, there was actually quite a lot of popular sentiment in favor of prisoner rights, prisoner reform. And one of the reasons for this was that, for example, in the South, there had been these horrible stories of prison abuse that came from, for example, the Arkansas prison farms, and just, that were still really being run like plantations. And so there'd been a lot of media about prison conditions. And so, for example, when polled, Americans were quite sympathetic to it. But then when Attica happens, I think people are kind of waiting on tenterhooks to kind of see, what is this about? What does this mean? And as you mentioned, we'll get to it. But what I would argue is that the way that the state decided to take the prison, that what happened afterwards had really an incalculable effect on the way the nation would understand Attica afterwards. And the way that the stories of the people who survived it, whether they were hostages or prisoners, really became secondary to a kind of a different story about, about the importance to kind of get stronger law enforcement and so forth, but not really understanding what had led to it to start with.
Mm-hmm. Donald, you had said earlier, one of your colleagues said, just be patient, help will be allowed.
Yeah, we were told once we heard the whistle, usually like Mike said, it was from a walk away from the farm detail or something. He said, we'll have enough help here pretty soon. They'll come in and get us. And, we waited and they didn't come. And it was the fifth day before they actually came. I have to say one thing. The state of New York definitely failed in not coming in on the first day, and we all know that. We put blame on everybody, from the governor to the commissioner, even to the correction officers that worked there. We were told we didn't understand the inmates, so therefore, if we didn't understand them, that's why they didn't like us. Well, they didn't like us because they were prisoners and we were guards. San Quentin had an incident. Do you mind if I tell it?
Go.
August 21st, 1971, San Quentin had a riot. George Jackson, we've all heard about him. He had a gun smuggled into special housing. He had actually killed 3 officers, cut 3 officers' throats, and killed a couple inmates and had hostages. A lieutenant by the name of Dick Nelson was living on grounds and he was off duty, painting his ceiling in his kitchen. He got the call. He went to the armory, drew a Thompson submachine gun, ran into special housing, pulled the trigger, killed all the inmates that were in there, saved the hostages, and the 4,000 inmates that were in the recreation yards went back and locked in their cells. It was over in 15 minutes. The state of New York could have done the same thing, and they elected, once they let the inmates get control, by picking who they wanted to come in for negotiation and allowing the news, free forecast, in and out. Mike and I and everybody else who was in the yard were at the mercy of the man upstairs and nobody else.
You provided some video of when the state troopers finally did come in. It wasn't exactly what you expected. We're going to look at the video, and then I want the two of you to talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
So let's roll that videotape that we have.
I can say one thing. I was in Vietnam 11 months and 20-some days. Came back, took the job at the prison. I was more fearful for my life in that 5 days at Attica, being tied up and blindfolded, than I was the whole time I was in Vietnam. Never to expect to come back and be caught in another war in my own hometown, or 8 miles from where I grew up.
Let's look at the videotape.
The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats.
Look at those men walking off.
Time is 9:45 a.m.
In that operation, 39 people were killed, including
Well, actually, a total of 43 died.
altogether.
Inmates had killed 3 of their own.
Mhm.
The 2 inmates that actually beat the officer to death. The funny part is when they closed the books on Attica, they were actually pardoned and released from jail.
Michael, when the state troopers began their assault on Attica, what's going through your mind as a hostage?
I was one of the 8 hostages that were randomly chosen to be displayed on top of the catwalk that was just showed in that video. And that was Monday morning when the state of New York mounted their assault to retake the facility. On Sunday evening, the negotiation process had pretty effectively broken down. It seemed to be headed in a positive direction, or we hoped it was anyway, up until the announcement of Bill Quinn's death. And the inmates' demands had primarily been of a humanitarian nature: better food, better education, more real work opportunity to learn a trade, more religious freedoms. Nobody was demanding that they wanted to escape from prison. With the announcement on Sunday night, it was obvious the state of New York was going to break off the negotiation process and had their own plan. In fact, Sunday night they sent in a Catholic priest to the hostage area to administer last rites to anybody that wanted it. And it was pretty evident that this wasn't going to come to a peaceful resolve. Monday morning, I think in kind of a last-ditch effort, the inmates had, and also the inmates' demands at that point in time, after Saturday's announcement of Bill Quinn's death, the officer that was beaten at Times Square, the inmate demand list grew to now I think it was 28 demands, as I recall. Yeah. And to include...
The key was amnesty.
The key was amnesty. The key, as Heather said, was amnesty. The inmates had to have amnesty because with the announcement that Bill Quinn died, each inmate could be found guilty of murder as an accessory to the event. And in a last-ditch effort to push their point, the inmates randomly chose 8 hostages from the hostage circle in the yard and put them on the catwalk totally irrational. There wasn't a lot of people thinking rationally at that time anyway, but I think that the thought was, well, we'll take these 8 hostages, stick them up there in front of everybody, assign inmate executioners to each hostage, and then bargain with the balance of the lives that we have in the yard. The state didn't move from their position, and a helicopter flew over the wall that morning. I was blindfolded. Probably what you'd conjure up as a typical execution scenario. I was blindfolded. I had 3 inmate executioners assigned to me. One was Don Noble, an inmate to my left. I had an inmate behind me with a ball-peen hammer and an inmate to my right side with a hand-fashioned spear that he'd made out of a metal file and ground down to a point in the metal shop and attached a broom handle to. And they were all identified, wore some type of identification that indicated that they were an executioner.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.